Tell me when.
Yep.
Okay. Welcome everybody to the Indexing Transformation Seminar Series. Today we are delighted to have Dr. Most Phadi, who's going to present a paper on Du Bois and Vico. As a bit of background, Dr. Phadi did a PhD at the University of Johannesburg and has spent time at Stellenbosch University. Is currently a senior lecturer in sociology at the University of the Free State. She's currently working on a book that hopefully will come out in the next year or two, of which this is a part. She's also written quite seriously and across a number of subjects. She's one of the co-authors of a very influential volume called Class in Soweto, and she's also been writing about racial capitalism. She's interested in the intersections of blackness and the economy and other social features, and has also been involved in research on social movements. So it's my great pleasure to welcome her. I know that the department will give her some robust questions and all the attention. So without much ado, Dr. Phadi.
Thanks, Bennett, for inviting me. Like, I really appreciate it. So because I've known Bennett for a very long time since he's a good comrade of mine. I think just to start off, just to give a context of this paper and where I'm trying to get it. I've been working a lot since my PhD really in terms of tracing Du Bois's thought. So when I started my PhD, that was not necessarily the intention, but Du Bois became a discovery in my PhD, and through that I've been trying to locate him and his ideas in South Africa in various ways. But Du Bois sort of links all my ideas from where my scholarship started, with class, thinking about race later on, and thinking around state, the making of the state through my work elsewhere in terms of local governance and so on, and thinking around all these things. How do we think about blackness in everything? Because it is everywhere, outside just an identity. Politics, and the making of the state in particular became a central feature in that. And also it's trying to, I don't know, like in a risky way, maybe not so risky, I'm not sure, trying to break away from only thinking around particular linear arguments that sometimes come with him. In terms of who he is and how do we think about it, i.e. this conversation around his earlier work, because one of the things that has happened with Du Bois in his earlier work, by and large, from Reid to Allen to and several other thinkers, Goodwin, I've been thinking about Du Bois as his earlier work as a liberal. Or reformist, whatever terminology you wanna use, and I'm breaking from that. I'm breaking from that analysis, trying to link my work to Chandler's work as well. Even though Chandler is like a philosopher in various ways, but I think he highly influenced this paper in a different way, but taking it a step further as well. So again, as I said, is to challenge this idea that W.E. Du Bois or Saul Plaatje were liberals. I don't know, it's just a brief history of them. So Saul Plaatje went to the US through Marcus Garvey, but later on became friends with Du Bois. Du Bois, when he was trying to publish his native life, he couldn't find publishers. He had difficulties, and Du Bois tried to help him in trying to find publishers and popularizing his work in the US. He did a review in the Crisis two reviews to be specific, as well as, so Plaatje did most people don't actually think about this. He translated Shakespeare's work into Setswana, one of the things that he was trying to do, and Du Bois was very influential in trying to make that also as popular as possible. So they have a longer relationship. They were close friends, they were confidants. They actually, some of the ideas actually, they pollinated. And this is where I'm trying to say it's not so Plaatje relying on Du Bois. There were like some synergies in the ideas as well in various ways. And what I'm trying to do, as I say, is trying to reread a new reading of Du Bois's work, but also of Plaatje's work, by opening Plaatje and Du Bois' thought through this radical historiography, which begins to see aspects of how their theory was based on economic analysis and class struggle from earlier on. And I'm playing with the idea that actually this economic analysis and class struggles is within the problematique of racial capitalism, not in the same way as Robinson, but some of the criteria that Robinson uses are actually embedded in that, and in trying to understand the dialectic of colonialism, slavery, resistance from the 16th century forward, and the formation of industrial labor and labor reserves from that perspective of Robinson's analytical ways, because Robinson talks about 4 criteria of racial capitalism in different ways. But also, as I said, it's taking through Chandler's work and trying to evoke the epistemological formations, which remain many registers of Du Bois's work from earlier on and of his work, before even the souls. There were many registers that actually are anchored, if you follow his thinking, around these ideas of global horizon, global modernity, the racialized nature of capitalism, and in that idea. So what am I trying to argue really? First is like both authors demonstrate how primitive accumulation in the historical development of capitalism required the exploitation of Black labor. Thus, Black inferiority it is part of the capitalist mode of operandi in both contexts. Second, as Robertson correctly observes, Du Bois understood that the relationship between slavery and democracy was not a question, was not a clash of ideas. Actually, it is coherent and is part of the ideology and entangled in the ideology of capitalism in itself. And Du Bois, Plaatje later on emphasized that the removal of land is part of building bourgeois democracy, but it's pretty much the logic again of capitalism in itself. And lastly, it's recognizing that territorial states and empires acquired land in plenty. So accumulation needs land. But also I'm arguing that Plaatje and Du Bois talk about this wealth accumulation in this uncharted landscape as the salvation, or like saving the white working class. So it was not, as much as they were accumulating land and were getting there, they were also, this process was about saving the white poor or the white working class in different periods, or different contexts, right? Not periods. And how do we, and I just want to take you a step back in terms of thinking around Du Bois's work. Often when the term, like most scholars, when they think about the radical turn of Du Bois, they think about the Black Reconstruction. If you haven't read Black Reconstruction, it's the most phenomenal. I think also it answers also some of the questions that we're dealing with currently in South Africa right now. It's a phenomenal, 1,000-page long book, but it's a masterpiece. But and often scholars, they say this is like a Marxist scholarship. This is where this is the towering work of history embodied in like the Marxist tradition. This is how they sort of articulate his work. And earlier, he's a liberal, and so on. And I'm arguing, actually, when you read Du Bois's work, the Black Reconstruction actually stems from much earlier, some of his ideas. I'll get into it. And often when people critique him as a liberal, they always go into this idea that because he evoked the talented 10th in the souls. The talented 10th is the idea of the educated, middle class Black people will be sort of like the key instrument in helping Black people as the revolutionary subject towards that. In many ways, he did. I mean, some of the ideas of Stalin, supporting Stalin in particular, Du Bois later in his life, I mean, throughout until his death, he was supporting Stalin. It's like this idea of the vanguard class that was very embedded in his ideas as well, i.e. the defense of Stalinism throughout his life. But also, I think when you think about the talented 10th, and this is where Chandler becomes so important. The talented 10th, and Chandler shows that he uses the word duty in the talented 10th. And what does it mean when you think about the word and you think about the word duty? Chandler says the supposed talented 10th is quite something other than the practice of elitism, because duty sought freedom, and duty was an emphasis of the collective and the individual responsibility to deal with the past, present, and future, to think beyond realities and fight for possibility of something that is yet to be born. So duty is something futuristic that is within ourselves and outside ourselves, not necessarily, and he breaks away from this elitist idea of thinking about the talented 10th as something, the vanguard. And I think it's a provocation that we can think about as we think about those terms. And when you think about Plaatje's work, often Plaatje's work is always seen through this capitalist class project, especially for Marxist, orthodox Marxist. And I think there is a huge problem. I think it's a discussion as well in terms of like how the tradition of Marxism in South Africa, or white Marxism in South Africa to be specific, because there's a longer Black Marxist ideas here, but the tradition that has dominated the academy has been white Marxist emphasis in terms of like they don't actually read Black Marxism in various ways. And often when they do, or they read Plaatje, it's always, this is a capitalist class project that Plaatje was doing, and also when they actually interpret his work, it's always through this, this is a great liberal text, in Sunday's work in terms of thinking about it. Or you get like this is like a Black Victorian because he came from the Berlin Mission Society, therefore he was evoking the ideas of like Black Victorian appealing to the empire, the British Empire, and Keith, Breckenridge, and so on. They've done some work, and their appealing is making a comparison between Mahatma Gandhi and Plaatje as the white progressive were moving towards racist models. They were making reformist appeals in terms of liberal justification of imperial government, especially for the British Empire. And it's far more complicated. I don't want to get into Breckenridge and making that comparison with Gandhi, because Plaatje was very critical about the Indian plight versus the Black plight, and it makes a very huge distinction in that. And I think sometimes when we do these readings, we forget how he makes these separations quite strongly. So I'm not arguing that people who are reading earlier work of Plaatje or Du Bois in a liberal or called capitalist work, they're not necessarily wrong. There's elements of it there, but I'm saying it's too crude, the analysis. And I'm trying to actually propose that many ideas can exist at the same time. And what does it mean when many ideas exist at the same time? And I think when we think about Black radical thought, that is a possibility in it as well. And how do I think about Du Bois in terms of like then land accumulation, Black inferiority, and those ideas. And I'm going to start from the beginning. I mean, like the study of the Negro, which was published in 1898, earlier on, starts already saying Du Bois describes the US in the latter part of the 17th century as a young country growing through rapid expansion. The growth changed the global economic and political landscape, driving global historical development. Demands for crops, especially in American South, changed labor and industrial conditions, generally through implementing large plantation slave systems. This economic monstrosity, he calls it, and a political menace, made a distinction between the slaves and the servants, applying different laws and giving Black people status of slavery. But it divided, he argues, earlier on, these two sort of working people, but from a different vantage point, producing, he says, a plex of social problems, some new, some old, some simple, some complex. Modern capitalism, through its historical and material development, not only vitally dependent on Black inferiority. When he gets to the souls, he says already by then, after like the late 17th century, through slavery and through plantations, the color line was a global problem. You know, it should be understood as a global problem. The problem of the color line. It's not something that just happened in the US. And it's many revolutions that actually took many forms and old forms at the same time. And how did these, revolutions take forms? Some of them brought out of war, murder, slavery, extinction, and debauchery, he calls it, in various ways. But also it changed the aspects of the everyday life. I mean, in the souls, he argues, all aspects of the everyday, in travel, in theater, in housing, in marrying, in giving, in marriage, just changed because of this racialized, embedded capitalism that actually became key. Even after the abolishment of slavery, it complicates, like, even what Blackness, even in itself, became complicated, primarily because what happened in America, the original slaves were no longer, now they were born in the country. So there was also this division between the slaves who came as the original and the new ones. And then when the abolishment happened, that also created a different type of conditions in it that actually complicates Blackness without other things. So the abolishment of slavery happens. When it happens, Black workers in the new dispensation were left alone, unguided, without capital, without land, without skills, without economic organization, and without the blind protection of law, order, or decency. In this period, capitalism was reconfiguring and rebuilding, while new and old capitalists acquired new thirst for wealth and power. But what happens with the Black elite, he argues, some acquired land and property, but they were too small to dent the economic system with any significant impact. The new structure created an elite or Black elite who were without land or regarded their freedom between the devil and deep sea, because they couldn't build the land without proper capital. And again, a land became located in the slave owners, the previously slave owners, as well as the new capitalists. Some of them who were once white working class, now actually with the new abolishment, reconfigured that and created opportunities for those white working class to actually become capitalists themselves. And these ideas, as you from the study of a Negro to the souls, now they actually become crystallized in a much longer process and articulation and thesis, I think. And a sort of radical turn, but I call it like a more ambitious thesis or theoretical work in the Black Reconstruction. And when you start seeing in the Black Reconstruction the same ideas in terms of like how land becomes important, how the Black working class are still confronted by the racial order and the saving of the new white people in terms of the chance to become capitalists, became property holders, and by birth, actually, started to learn new things. And he says, the ideology of racism excluded Black people economically because they said, and I quote, slavery was wrong, but not all wrong. This is like the white logic in terms of the white working class who were against slavery, abolishment of slavery, fighting for slavery one level, but also the contradictions in it. Slavery was wrong, but not all wrong. Slavery must perish, and not simply move. God made Black man. God made slavery. The will of God be done. Slavery to the glory of God, and the Black man as his servant and ours. Slavery as a way to freedom, the freedom of Blacks, the freedom of whites. White freedom as the goal of the world. Black slavery as the path thereto. Up with the white world, down with the Black. So the logic, again, in terms of what he was trying to argue, in terms of in Black reconstructions and also in other things, it's like there was always this preservation in this capitalist logic of preserving the poor whites. In the old slavery, they were used as police in terms of entrenching segregation law. But later on, they were, as abolishment came, the logic of still keeping Black people as the lowest class, you know, the other poor white people or working class were able to sustain some type of economic things. And you start also seeing this logic of the white logic or whiteness or the white souls, he calls it, in Dark Waters within the Voices. If you haven't read Dark Waters, I mean, everybody's talking about white privilege. There's a chapter there about white souls, which is such a crucial, and I think is one of the first few to actually start think about the reactionary positions of white working class and the white souls and thinking about white privilege in a far more complex way than we are at this moment. And he says this logic is not, these are European logic. Going back to, again, Robertson, he talks about how racial capitalism is, it's a logic of Europe. This is how they preserve. It's not insanity. You know, it's not outside its logic. He says it has always been in the interest of white Europe to structure capitalism that divides and is based on racial nature and exploitation. And I argue these ideas actually of Du Bois also permeate in Plaatje's work. And how do they do that? I mean, the most quoted Plaatje's phrase in terms of the understanding of modern capitalism, it's when he actually, in his opening, awakening on Friday morning, June 20, 1913, the South African native found himself not only as a slave, but a pariah in the land of his birth. That's the most quoted Plaatje's phrase in terms of explaining the land dispossessions, where it was at the heart of the historical and economic development in South Africa. But he says the formation was embedded in the rationale of making Black majority servants. The strategy, simply put, was, I quote, a kafir who refused to become a servant should be at once be consigned to the road. It means if you don't become a servant, you'll be homeless in various ways. And indeed, that's what became in that process. Land dispossession was integral in making Black people inferior. Plaatje also demonstrates that even before the act was passed, you know, he has this long, I don't know if anybody has read the Native Life, but he has like these long codes in terms of the debates that happens in Parliament about the how white people were like in terms of in parliament were debating the issues. And he says even before that, the white Plaatarians who debated its merit were fully aware of the importance of black labor. And he quotes this guys who ask others, who has built our railway, who has decked our mines and developed this country as so far it was developed, who has been the actual manual worker, who has done that? And the white Plaatarian answered precisely, the native, the color races of this country. And he argues that this logic and the land was key maker in the world in terms of like competing with capitalism worldwide, globally. And the imagination of the British was always present in these debates in various ways. And I think if you go through the book, you start seeing they always worry about, you know, the British, how much it's going to cost, figures around how much we're going to actually profit, we're going to actually get from different industries, and how much it's going to cost in relation to the British crown, as they would call it in the book. But also he argues, he shows as well in the book, the dependency on cheap labor jotted even the daily experience of white people. Plaatje narrates a scene in which a white woman is nervous that her domestic worker might leave the job because she's in love, and I quote, and if a town Tafe is going to marry Anna, where on earth am I going to get a reliable servant to whom I could secure and trust my home when I have occasions to go to town or to the seaside on a shorter or longer vacation? Panic that, you know, these townships might actually, and, you know, people can just get married, and how do we survive? So the intimacy and the dependency on Black workers was quite important. But he does something else in the book, and if you go through, I mean, the book, he uses the word deliberately, poor white, throughout the Free State. He uses that word, and he says poor whites were preserved, protected, and salvaged through this Land Act. Plaatje notes that the Dutch removed Black people from their farms, replaced them with poor whites. He uses that word again. For these poor whites whose status was elevated, the Land Act permitted them to employ Black labor, even though many did not have the money to pay them a wage. He provided an account of poor white farmer willing to employ a landless Black family. The men worked in the field, the women inside the house, the children assisted with various chores. To supplement the Black family's wages, the black man was told to leave his family at work on the farm and go out with his ox, with his wagon and his ox to earn money whenever and wherever he was told to go by this white person. Moreover, he says, there was a swipe out of railway and postal services with a strong racial broom in order to make room for poor whites, mainly the Dutch descent, in the railway and so on. So the logic of the Land Act was just not only dispossession, it was embedded and in this process. Ideologically and in law, the rationale was clear. Kafirs were inferior beings. Therefore, white people needed to have undisturbed possessions of their property, he argues. And I think if you start thinking through, then both Du Bois and Plaatje, within this paradigm of racial capitalism, you start to see actually, for them, it's a historical development that actually was at the cornerstone of it, making Black inferior, but also that land was just not only just occupying land. There was a logic in it. And part of the logic was not only taking the territory, but also to save a particular class, which was inherently not Black, and actually the people who benefited were the poor whites in this process of thinking around it. And these things are also intimate. This racial, it's not only structural in its very nature, it's a very intimate relationship that actually permeates in all parts of our lives, that affects also white people in different ways as we think through racial capitalism and how it works in these processes. But these ideas are much longer, I'm arguing, with Du Bois, and actually they stem from his earlier work rather than like his later work. That's pretty much. I think I'll leave it there. Let's see.
Maybe you can just check the online people.
Yeah, okay, we'll try and keep an eye. Are they unmuted? Oh, they unmute themselves, right?
If they unmute themselves, we'll hear them.
Okay, thanks so much, Musa, for a fascinating talk. Very exciting to listen to these theoretical kind of analysis of yours. Online people, we wait for your comments. In the room, we have a few open for comment. Does anybody want to kick us off? Okay, Jan.
Yeah, thanks, Musa. I'll start with a comment that says, thank you so much for bringing Plaatje into the discussion. One of the, I would call it, Black intellectual founders of this South Africa, that we call it South Africa. Thank you so much. I came late, but something struck me as you were talking about the comment. I think you were reading a quote that says slavery was wrong, but not all was wrong. And I immediately thought about some of the comments we hear about when things go bad in the country, economically, politically, and socially, otherwise. You hear people saying that apartheid actually was much better. Life was much better under apartheid. And I'd like you to sort of speak to that. You've read the material, and you sort of understand the thinking, the logic behind statements like slavery was wrong, but not that everything was wrong was ever end. How would one read this idea that in fact life was much better under apartheid? Thank you.
That's it.
Oh.
Yeah. That's good, I say.
Yes.
Well, firstly, thank you so much. Such an interesting and enriching seminar. And something that I haven't, my research focus is not really in, but something that's extremely interesting and informs a lot of the research that we do, so I think it's very useful. One statement you made was the color line was global, right? And that's analytically interesting. But I also think about when you're comparing Du Bois and Plaatje, what are the particularities around each context that might have actually caused, I can see there's some synthesis between their work, and you said there was a conversation, but what were perhaps some of the tension points that you picked up between their works, and perhaps how that is grounded in particular context? So South Africa, when, around Plaatje's work, certainly the 1913 Act is important, and getting close enough to apartheid, but not really apartheid. How does that inform a certain understanding of South Africa and racial capitalism in South Africa in comparison to Emancipation Proclamation in the US, how that embeds that? But also something that leads onto that, and this is the second question, that you speaking of Du Bois's belief, positioning of himself as a sort of, or there's a black middle class that can be vanguardist and play a certain position, and obviously the critique that we've heard of the ANC now as a sort of middle class party that was later established by Ndela Sisulu and so on, and like he says, like himself being quite an intellectual. So the positioning of the black middle class in as an analytical framework of comparison. Thank you very much.
And I'll throw my question in as well. Is that enough?
I think let's take two.
Okay.
We have time. Yeah. Oh, yeah, we have time.
And then anyone online, please do type, I'll read, or you can put up your hand.
Oh, okay. You wanted to ask?
I think two is fine.
Oh, okay.
We have a small audience, so.
Okay, that's fine. There's always, Yankee, there's always I think, And I was talking to Bernard actually about theory. And the Black Reconstruction, really, I'm surprised. It's way better than even like, I think if you read the Black Reconstruction and actually Das Kapital, it opens up your eyes in different ways. And in the Black Reconstruction, he critiques, because at a particular point, like in South Africa and the Cape Colony, so there's like the Black leadership that goes into governance at some point and between things. And he goes, Du Bois like is reflecting on terms of like how they've been received. And what are the language that they use in that process. And funny enough, the same logic here, they're corrupt. No, like, I mean, he uses the word, is these Black people are corrupt. These Black people cannot read, they don't know what they do, they can't even govern. They don't have skills. It's extraordinary. I mean, like, when you think about it, he wrote this in like 1935 in terms of like reflecting in terms of after Reconstruction, what happened in terms of the logic of how racism and its ideology comes in terms of thinking about Black governance. And the languages that we use actually at this moment, we do not have skills, they are corrupt, they just sit around being lazy, they're incompetent, and they cannot even fix, we give them, all the resources, but even in those resources, they cannot actually do anything. And he argues these are actually embedded in itself in the logic of racism and how it actually plays out in thinking around these questions. And I do think as we think through, again, this moment where we are, which is it can go either way. We are in that moment where many things have gone wrong and many things can still go wrong at the same time. But it's not only for us, but also for the world. How do we envision, how do we break away from certain logic that is actually inherently racist, that is actually perpetuates those ideas? At the same time, how do we think about the democracy in a different way that is not bourgeois? And again, maybe bourgeois democracy is inherently racist. Maybe we should be thinking about those things. I mean, he makes those arguments as well, that actually bourgeois democracy, it is racist in its logic, i.e. apartheid, there was nothing wrong with it. He's actually saying this is part of the things where, every time I come to the Western Cape, it's like, I don't know. The idea of the color line, I mean, it's thinking through, again, modern capitalism at this time. And he's arguing already when it became, it is fruition after, from like slavery in its height and later on, even after the abolishment, the world was already thinking racial terms. Therefore, the racial problem was in itself a mode of operandi, part of capitalism. It does this, the idea, even like when you think about it, he calls them the yellow people, but around what happened in terms of Asia and so on, even in this building, even though like it didn't directly in the same level as elsewhere affect them, but it was also, there were elements there of thinking about capitalism, the yellow people in a different way, which was also inherently that. There's tensions, of course there's tensions. I mean, the tensions in terms of, they were writing in different contexts of majority, minority context. There's tensions in terms of, when we think about America, we think about only around the, the South. He writes primarily about the South, and in various ways in terms of like, that's where the heartland of some of his analysis is. But Black is writing about complicating the English and the Dutch, it's the term that he uses. And what does it mean in terms of that? And he shows as well in terms of how they imagined capitalism, even though both was racist in itself, but how they imagined it was very different and also collided at the same time. They agreed on the racism, but how they imagined it, it's different. And those conversations inherently would never be a conversation in terms of thinking about Du Bois's work in various ways. But also there's like a long attention in terms of that some of the ideas of Du Bois were not, some of the ideas that emerged in South Africa were influenced Du Bois in various ways. His response in Dark Waters, his response in in various other work, you'll see how much he's starting to rethink some of the ideas because he wrote for longer, like that's the thing, he had time. And you can start seeing how he changes his own formation. And South Africa is very central to it. He couldn't come. He was barred. He had tried many times to come to this country, but he was barred in various ways. And this is, and I mean, I can say so much. I mean, the idea of a revolutionary subject, the middle class, the Black middle class, what they ought to do. This is like a long-seated conversation, even in the ANC. For example, sometimes some people have this thing around, the ANC was the same. This is a bourgeois party. Okay, in one level you're right. In one level there were debates. I mean, like Jabavu was for like civilized Blacks are the ones who are supposed to vote. Socha was like, actually everybody should vote. Those were serious conversation in the ANC. What is the role of a woman? I mean, and Plaatje was one of the, again, with Du Bois as well. I mean, they didn't write it in the most feminist possible way, but they actually, women were at the very center of also playing a leadership role, and they write about that. And you can argue it wasn't, at that time was progressive, I guess, when the Jabavus and other people were against those various things. What is the role of the middle class? I mean, like, this is of the Black intelligentsia in South Africa. I think it's a long sitting conversation that is always in different epoch shapes us. It depends where the struggle emerges. And actually people forget also the struggles didn't emerge in the cities. Most of the struggles emerge in rural areas. Of course, the middle class will be important because there was a part of our capitalism was the wipe out of peasantry workers. And we don't have the peasants. And that makes it complicates far more bigger questions. Therefore, of course, because we don't have the peasantry as much, the middle class sort of become, but actually it's far more complicated because the Black middle class, as much as they come with also, it's a historical thing. We have a long history of Black liberals, we have a long history of conservatives, we have a long history of left politics in this country. And actually, these are the debates that we actually have to start thinking about as we think and as we emerge as Black people. Like, these are longer history. It's not Mandela sold us out conversation. It's a long history that comes with our intellectual work as well. That is uncomfortable, but it's real.
Thank you. Okay, Bernard.
So thank you. This was incredibly rich and thinking about lots of things. I mean, one of the things that strikes me is, in terms of the comparison, is the tension between a society that's just emerging from slavery. And of course, if you look like Du Bois did from the South, right? And I always told my students when I taught Du Bois and I taught 12 of the Souls, his optic is 40 years. He writes in 1903, The Souls. 40 years after, or less than 40 years after the end of slavery. How has race been reconfigured with 37, 40 years of freedom, so to speak, of legal freedom? And how do we think about that if we teach it, if we're thinking 25 years from apartheid? How do we think about this as a comparative lens? So I've always taught it in that way. Like, what does Du Bois of 100 years ago, 120 years ago, teach us about South Africa today? So the slavery angle as a moment, as a kind of pivot from, to understand a period of transition. Of course, the way you're doing it is interesting. Is very interesting. It's got me thinking. Okay, what is it to think about these contemporaries, Plaatje and Du Bois, and both of them observing a process, in Du Bois's case, of a moment of emancipation formally from slavery, but also of land dispossession that followed emancipation. Plaatje of a moment of not slavery per se, because cage slavery wasn't really part of his analytic, but more land dispossession, progressive land dispossession. And one of the questions that came up, in a recent seminar, was in South Africa, when we understand racial capitalism, there's a lot of emphasis on labor, and race and labor is connected. That racism, the modern form of racism in South Africa, is connected to mines, to migrant labor, and some people would argue that it's much older than that. And I'm wondering if we bring Du Bois into that conversation, what do we do? In other words, there's a classic understanding, a kind of revisionist Marxist understanding, that racism comes out of a form of capitalism that emerges with black people being dispossessed of the land and having to work, and then accepting cheap labor, cheap wages. And in the American case, of course, you didn't have exactly the same kind of racial state, but you have a much longer history of race and economy tied together. And even when you have freedom, you have you have a kind of form of racial disenfranchisement and racial exploitation that come together. I think Black Reconstruction is a very interesting part. So I guess in all of my kind of rambling comments, I think the question is, what does Du Bois teach us about racial capitalism in South Africa? That's the simple question. And does the comparative histories of slavery or lack of slavery or different kinds of slavery, how does it complicate the story?
Is someone with their hand up?
Yes.
Sebeka, if I'm saying that correctly, sorry. I don't see your full name.
Oh, yes. Am I audible?
Yep.
Okay, thank you so much, colleagues, for such an interesting conversation. But just maybe an opinion from my side. I find, in fact, maybe this is the question that's a bit complex, because I find it very difficult to separate the political life of Plaatje from his social and intellectual. I mean, there are serious contradictions that you can see right there. I'll make a particular example now. Whereas if he may appear to be one who critique racial capitalism, one would be, more propensity to read him perhaps within the, the black Marxist type of tradition. But when you look at his political life and social life, you see something radically different. And in this instance, I'd like to take his life, looking at his literary works. In particular, how he related to the idea of a woman. Women, especially at the time when, male chauvinism could be understood to have been the predominant type of, of ideology. If you look at the instance with Charlotte Maxeke, at the time that women were not supposed to vote, he was the one who stood up to say, look, she's going to stay in the room. She's the most qualified, with a degree within the ANC, committee at the time. And you also look at Mohudi, where, the hero in the entire novel becomes a woman. And his upbringing, always referring to his mother and his grandmother, who were actually an inspiration for him to learn the language of Setswana. His relationship and his inspiration from Olive Schreiner, and for him to speak just openly. And again, he's the only person who went to visit women who were imprisoned after the first past protest. So when you look at all those activities only around women, at the time that, women were actually the subcategory of everything that you could think, whether black or white. But for him to openly speak in reverence about women, even fictitiously making, them heroes in his own writing is quite significant, suggesting also the point that he took them very seriously at the time that was quite hostile to women liberation and so on. So for me, I would even go to the point that actually Sol Plaatje was the first declared male feminist. I don't know, that would be stretching it, a bit more, but judging by what he has done with his relationship with women in those instances that I've mentioned, you could clearly see that. But I also like the comment that was made earlier on about, the black middle class. I think that comment is very important. The black middle class, as having been the political agency at the time, should not necessarily be dissociated or maybe read within the contemporary understanding of what middle class is within the liberal context. Black middle class could swing both ways. I would like to understand. They could have even been Marxist and also, embrace the liberal tradition. And here comes in the very, very difficult, negotiation and the complexity to say, can a middle class become a Marxist, if you like, in orientation. But, the idea that was presented now that there is and was actually the possibility of seeing that. Du Bois, for example, as one colleague has mentioned, it was quite an interesting revelation. I also about the contestation about who's got the right, who should be able to vote within that context. That and the different views around that within the ANC. That is quite significant, pointing precisely to the fact that indeed, middle class, being a black middle class at the time, could not have necessarily automatically meant that everyone falling within that category would quite be a natural liberal, so to speak. This is just what I wanted to say. And maybe to throw it up to everyone is just to ask everyone's views about this. I mean, could we really say Plaatje was other than a liberal? Of course, also having, him later, well, I wouldn't say dissociating him from Marcus Garvey, but leaning more towards Du Bois as well. Thank you so much.
Okay, go ahead.
This is difficult. How does Du Bois teach us about South Africa? I think it's not a teaching. I think for me, it's like, how do we, because I'm interested in intellectual histories, in terms of how they form and at what points do they form and when do they change in black thought, in various ways. And Du Bois, what he does well is to change as time changes. Some things are consistent, and that's the point. Some of these ideas are consistent, but some of these ideas actually, they change he responds to time in various ways. And I think there's an appreciation of that. And he spoke to everybody, the amount of conversations. And at that time, we think we have internet and we can connect. You actually be surprised how much people connected with everybody everywhere in the world. And it was in conversation. He tried as much as he can to actually be on par with those ideas. The rigorness that came with that as well. But I do agree with you. How do we understand slavery after? It's the failure, like the idea of how free black inferiority, even the glimpse of it, even in the small freedoms, and which they are there. I mean, and I think Du Bois, what it shows, is the small freedoms, and I keep saying this, the small freedoms that exist But even in the small freedoms, there is still this lingering thing that still, but structurally, that actually fails for Black emancipation. And I think as we think even today, you know, we have had small freedoms. I think, you know, except when I'm here, but by and large, Black people, especially the middle class, are very much, the Black elite, they live very different lives from the poorest of the poor. But at the same time, it's sustained. But at the same time, it's also thinking through, as much as going to the middle class issue about the Black middle class, it's also his failure to understand that revolution does not come from the talented 10. They capture the working class revolution. And this is the crisis sometimes we will, and this is the African like history. It starts from the working class, the people who capture it. Sorry to use like the politically loaded word now these days. Once upon a time, Sabara Machel wanted to capture the state. I'm just saying, you know, it's like a revolutionary term. But in itself, it's how sometimes the Black middle class are reactionary themselves. They're actually counter-revolutionary. At the core of it is like the people who start the revolution never actually finish the revolution. It's always captured by, and I think as we think through this Black middle class, even now or whenever, those days, the limits that comes with, important, but the limits that comes with it as well, within that. But it's not the same, and I think what every time when they actually speak about Du Bois, even Plaatje, they're not the same as Booker Washington, they're not the same as Dube. You know, it's not the conservative edge of the politics here, that it's based on assimilation, it's based on that. It's actually ultimate freedom and its best, and what does it look like that they imagined? That it comes with, in one point, full democracy, that comes with equal opportunity, that comes with everybody being free from the very essence of it, and actually equality. Where do we place those things? And I think as we think through this ideas, those questions haunt us. And how do they manifest themselves in different ways? I think that's where his work becomes so important at different points. And also what becomes Pan-African is what doesn't become Pan-African. You know, those ideas are also become such an important thing that his work contributes. But his failure is, I guess, the centering of the middle class is the revolutionary subject. And it's not his own failure alone. I think the Stalinists have the same, and the Maoists, and you know, that particular left-leaning people in Marxism, even though I'm a Marxist, they critique it. Yeah.
Yeah, there's another.
Okay, yeah, we'll get that question now. Thanks, Most Phadi. Add my questions. So firstly, I think it's really fascinating, very refreshing talk. I see you, you mentioned this intellectual history, and I see you're resisting a kind, and it's a global movement, and you see it in scholarship all over the world, right? Where an earlier mode of reading kind of native intellectuals always put them in the frame of a European tradition. And I like how you actually suggest, well, you need to read Reconstruction alongside Capital, and then you can actually understand it, because presumably there is something that they bring, that these things, the theorists are bringing. So I was wondering whether, so my first question is, do you see, are you interested in potentially also expanding this, this discussion, say, between Ambedkar and Gandhi?
Yeah.
For example, and there's a lot of scholarship about that, very different ways in which they kind of enter this question of the political. And whether actually, I'm wondering were there actually debates? Do you come across debates between these figures like Plaatje and Du Bois and, later in their lives and what's happening?
I had a conversation with Du Bois.
Okay. The reason, then the next question I noticed when you spoke about Plaatje, you mentioned he uses the idea of pariah. So as much as he's kind of critical of Gandhi, which I would agree, I could see why he would be at that time, Gandhi himself changes his positions a bit he becomes a very much more critical, of empire and also, industry and all kinds of things. But the term pariah, from the little I know, also has, it has this rooting in, the pariahs who are the underclass in India. And again, so I'm just read that, but maybe you have this link with Ambedkar. Another point, I mean, I see you actually challenging some of the orthodoxies of South African scholarship, which, I mean, I'm sure you would agree. I found now being back in South Africa, it seems to be very insular. There's certain things people have said, and then those are taken for granted, and there's no possibility of critique, especially when it's these very important white leftists, right? Because they seem to really dominate the narrative. Now, one of the things I've noticed, and as you see it in anthropology, is that this is enamored, they're enamored, the South African scholarship, I don't want to call it white, we just call it South African. South African scholarship, because that's the dominant trope, is like enamored with this question of influence, So you're always trying to trace, right, that there's an influence outside of this thing, which kind of contaminates it. So you see it now since roads must fall, It's almost as if just stating that these people are reading American sources almost like discredits it, And I think you are actually challenging some of this in significant ways, both by showing that, there's a long history of entanglement, of debate, but also that there are something quite specific, right, about ideas that develop in places. But the specificity, and I think this is so crucial, the specificity doesn't mean it's only limited to South Africa or only limited to America, right? Because all theory must come from specifics in order to be general. There's maybe another comment. My other question is another comment about slavery. So I would go against what Bernard was suggesting, trying to figure out whether slavery or not and the condition of slavery. I hear you saying through Plaatje is actually saying that slavery is part of the South African story, right? That story you gave about the farm. And I'm wondering, is there something here about not having land makes you a potential slave? And this potentially goes back, beyond this idea of, Atlantic slavery, but to the very nature of slavery, right? Without land, but also without a kind of a social network. And so the Land Act, and I don't know if this is, it'll be interesting to hear more about if Plaatje is saying that, right? If his analysis of the Land Act is already showing that, then the making of the slave coming through the Land Act, or potential slavery, then actually what you have is a complete kind of, Wolpe and all these guys, the analysis is actually extremely, almost ahistorical, or what do you call it, like bounded to a time period that doesn't work. And I was wondering, this bringing slavery into the narrative reminds me of the work of Habiba Badroun and Pumla Dameyo-Kola, who also center the slave experience, and and especially because you're bringing in the body, you keep on speaking about intimacy. So I guess that's my last point. Just giving you whatever I thought. But it's like, there's something about the intimacy, the intimate aspects, which you seem to be telling us to bring, you're telling Marxists actually to bring into the Marxist analysis. I don't know, I mean, look, it's a long project. Okay, one or two questions, but otherwise comments were thought. I have another. No, there's one more. We got 20 minutes. Talal Asad wrote about this in the context in his critique of Ernest Gellner in the 1970s. And he's writing about how Gellner and Evans Pritchard are having a debate about how to understand the native voice. Right? It's central to anthropology. It's a very anthropological discussion. And one of the observations he comes up with, 1973 essay, is that he has this way of putting it, I'm just going to paraphrase, it's like an observer trained in, say, Western intellectual traditions will find half-transformed styles of life, and that's what he calls them, whether we agree with it or not. And they will always read industrial capitalism into it. And this was his critique against that. Either it's pure native, or all the natives being transformed. And I think this element there is also a critique of the Manchester School and, Max Gluckman, which is still very strong in South Africa, that the native is not changing, and so there. So there's another debate there I think you could potentially insert. Stephen has a question online.
I'm wondering, thanks very much, Dr. Phadi. Do you want to respond first to Shahid's question? Because there was a lot there, and then I can come in a bit later. It seems to be echoing from my side quite a bit.
Sorry, Stephen, we'll mute us when you talk, but also what do you prefer?
Okay, no, that's fine. It is a lot. I mean, I don't dive into kindly that type of debate at all. It's in the periphery of my analysis in my level. Although Accra and Du Bois were in conversation, and there's a lot of work that were done in terms of thinking about the caste systems and racism and how does it actually manifest itself. But that's not my central project in that regard. My central project, it's mainly in terms of thinking around how his work, Du Bois's work, influenced and actually permeated within the South African landscape, and how the South African landscape or intellectuals shape his thinking as well in the process of, late 1800s to the 1960s. Really, that's where I'm focusing on. And what does it tell us about today? That's where the main thing is. But I think you mentioned something very interesting around influence, and it's true. I mean, again, I was like, I haven't read. He presented a paper in Wiser Seekings the other time in terms of this critique that Black, the student movement is influenced by the Americans. Funny enough, there's a long history, and he's saying this. It was like there's a long history of white right wing who are influenced by white right wing America, and his logic it is quite like it's like, when he was speaking. Then he was like, "This sounds like a right wing conservative party right now. You sound like them." These imported ideas from these ideas. It's like, this is exactly the point. And he's saying it as if he's saying something radical. It's interesting. And I think this is how, again, intellectual ideas of like Black people, just Black, especially South Africa, and it's a logic of like whiteness, because I think what happens sometimes is like, actually white people don't think in South Africa, we think. That we never have written work of like 160 years, because they don't never read our work anyway. So, and then it's like these ideas that just came from somewhere else. You couldn't think of it independently, nationally. You have to be someone else. And I think there's a problem there in terms of like the logic of how we analyze the now, because we actually there's a long body of work that no white leftist that comes from Black tradition that none of us refer to. Like, it's like a vacuum of some sort. And I'm not romantic. Sorry, I'm a colonized. I always say this. I'm a colonized subject. I like written work. My history starts from with written Black work that is there, that is strong. I'm not indigenous, so I think that actually it's an idea that actually, as much as progressive Black radical ideas, some of it were in conversation. White, right wing and conservative ideas and liberal ideas actually were also parallel and influenced. And Ferguson actually writes a lot of work on that in terms of like that work and how the link between right wing South Africans and right wing Americans actually are on par outside the German logic that came later on in this thinking. And I think it's something that we have to think about. But and I'm against the idea that it's just Americans coming with us, and therefore we're not. And actually, when you start seeing, it is a conversation, like in terms of like some of later work of Du Bois, some of these articles on the crisis and so on, they were very much influenced by the debates that are actually emerging in South Africa in a different way. And then we can talk about also even the term racial capitalism and the influence of South Africa versus how it gets that. And sometimes different ideas because of the experiences of like inferiority in different ways that manifested itself in different ways from America and South Africa. actually people can arrive at the same ideas, like not necessarily in conversation, you know. And I think that in its own, it's a story to tell in terms of that. And the idea of, I mean, like our history outside the Western Cape, the Transvaal was actually dabbling in slavery in itself. Like people forget this actually outside the Cape. Yeah, there were, you know, those things where they were selling black bodies as well in a different way. This is part of our history. And of course, slavery is in every conversation, especially in the Cape Colony, but everywhere in the Transvaal as well, that we don't talk about in that different. But I think it's very different from America. And I think we have to be clear about that. Our experiences as a majority makes a difference. Our experiences as we know aspects of who we are versus the American experiences, that as we preserve language in a different way compared to others, that makes a huge complications that are very different. Our experiences that even in the eradication of the black, I mean, a part of the contestation that Plaatje is trying to have is that there was a deliberate act to eradicate, compared to India, eradicate aspects of like the black elite, aspects of that, but it didn't win. You know, in that process, and I think Colin Bundy's work shows the complications of the black elite in the rural areas in terms of like that even in that eradication, there was still preserving of it, including, I mean, Plaatje, when you think about it, he had like, you know, he didn't finish primary school, but he was like, you know, he was supported by the Bafokeng royalty. They were millionaires for you. When you think about it, it's like these people were millionaires for centuries, guys. But you know, like there was still like that remnants again of like the black elite that is far complicated that we actually haven't touched on a serious note in a small but important in different ways. That is very different from the intellectual class. It is different from like how the missionaries were created. Of course, the missionaries becomes important in this intellectual, but it's not all the conversation. And in various ways that we also have to think about as we think through these ideas. And so therefore, you know, as much as it is, American story is eradication of every part of an identity. I think there was eradication in this country, but it was not all part of our identity. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, thank you. Very clear. That's great. Okay, Stephen.
Stephen, we'll mute and you can go ahead.
Okay, thanks very much for this really interesting talk. I actually just have a brief question. I'm interested. I don't know whether you've come across Michael Rothberg's Multi-Directional Memory. It's quite an interesting book. I mean, he's looking at the mutual engagement of key intellectuals such as Césaire, Du Bois, Fanon, even Hannah Arendt features in this, where they're sort of looking across different histories. So in this case, he's interested in connections between Black historical experience and victims of fascism, Nazism. And he's trying to make an argument that there's a recent shift to a more competitive sense of memory, and whereas earlier there was what, using a shorthand, could be called a more internationalist sensibility of Césaire, Du Bois, and others. And this is sort of illustrated in Du Bois's visit to the Warsaw Ghetto, where he comes back and he says, nothing in my wildest imagination prepared me for this. And he writes a piece called On a Dedication to the Warsaw Ghetto Fighters, published in 1952. And this it's quite interesting in so many ways, because he studied in Germany and he really valorized German scholarship and German science. You know, he studied in Berlin, and, you know, the rise of fascism made all sorts of connections for him very clear. So I'm interested in how he gets to what some have called, and he may have used the term, unitary theory of racism and prejudice, which comes out of, certain encounters, such as the, visit to the Warsaw Ghetto, which gets him to write that. Does this have a lingering trace in his scholarship? And is any of this part of an internationalist sensibility that, Du Bois shared with many others? Do you find traces of that? Because you certainly see that in Césaire and Fanon too. So it's a longer comment / question than I thought, but I hope you can assist me. So it's that Rothberg argument about, he calls it multi-directional memory. I wonder if there's something we can refer to as multi-directional scholarship, which looks across histories and makes connections across histories and historical experience, as opposed to a kind of more separatist or less internationalist orientation. Thank you.
Okay, great. If we don't have any more questions, then we'll give Musa the final word.
I mean, Du Bois wrote in various aspects outside, and I'm worried about. I don't know how to answer this, because Du Bois traveled around, and of course was influenced by a little bit of Weber's work. He didn't go to the lectures when he was there. I mean, he didn't meet Weber himself when he was there, but some of his methodologies were highly, highly influenced by that. Even Philadelphia Negro, in terms of thinking through the subjectivities, were some of the extension of it. I mean, his work in terms of thinking about sociology, it was an extension and actually breaking from that various ways. His work in terms of thinking around when he went to China, his work in thinking around when he went to Liberia, his work around the Pan-Africanist ideas of it, were at the very core of it. But I worry again about sometimes South African, this avoidance of his work was at the core of trying to understand the Black plight across, yes, within an internationalist ideas, and he was doing that in various ways. But at the core of his work, it was the problem, the color line, and actually how the plight of Blackness actually was actually manifested itself, became internationalized, globalized in different ways, how it actually affected not only Black people, but international relations in various ways. That was at the core of it, in terms of thinking about the UN. What is the role of the UN? He wrote a whole book on the role of the UN. He wrote a whole book in terms of thinking about Pan-Africanism and, the Congress on, the first Pan-Africanist Congress. He invited, there were white people there. The first Pan-Africanist was full of white people from South Africa instead of that, and they had to change all of those ideas. But I find it very bizarre sometimes with South African scholars, where this absence of let's talk about internationalism as if race is not at the very core of his work. Let's avoid, we cannot, and I think his work also deals with, we cannot find emancipatory if that question is not even dealt with. And I think that's the failure of Marxism in this country, and the failure of movements that are not, because everybody just avoids the elephant in the room, that race and class are actually at the very core of these things that also include international questions. And that's his, that's his whole work. So that is internationalism. And he was aware of those debates, and he did think about those debates critically, but it was not, but with a particular purpose. And his purpose was there, i.e., at the end of the day, was to also write about the encyclopedia of Africans in thinking about them as part of the world. Because at the core of it, he makes this bold statement: democracy was brought to the world by Black people. nobody else thought about democracies and Black people actually as they fight through it. That's what he says, as we think about it. And when you think about it in a philosophical question, again, it's a global question.
Oh, fascinating. Thank you so much for that important, I think, I think we look forward to, thank you for coming, for talking here. And I think it will be interesting to see how we incorporate your ideas and also follow your project in our teaching and just in shaping the archive. Because it seems, we know, right, that thanks to, I can't remember his name now, but yeah, the archive and the kinds of arguments often determine the kinds of questions that can be asked. And I think you are actually breaking this up for us, not just through imagination, but actually through close reading of the work. And together with your theoretical imagination, which is incredibly sophisticated. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you for all of you for attending. And see you all next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone online.